Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the convicted serial killer Gerald Eugene Stano, and we're also going to be talking about Madam X. That was the Jane Doe that was found in Altamont Springs, Florida in November of 1974. She's also known as Madam X. But to put it into context, I'm going to talk about all of his victims so that you can get an idea that these are just not names on a list and that he had a certain MO, modus operandi. So let's get started. In Florida in the 1970s, there was a serial killer almost prolific as Theodore Robert Bundy. This serial killer was also housed at Florida State Prison near Stark, along with Bundy. At one point, he and Bundy were even scheduled to be executed on the very same day. Why haven't you heard much about Gerald Eugene Stano? I don't know. He wasn't sexy or educated. He didn't have much charisma, contrary to his own opinion. He was quite unremarkable. Stano was a doughy man with dark eyes and thick, dark hair that he parted on the right side. Stano was hairy, his arms, his chest, his face. He often sported mutton chops and a goatee. He wore his shirts open and unbuttoned at the chest like a Saturday Night Fever 1970s Lothario. He wore Roy Orbison-like black glasses and smoked cigarettes. Stano's murderous modus operandi, method of operation, was as follows. Drinking and lonely, he liked to cruise around in his beloved cars, trolling Tampa Bay's nightclub strip, Daytona Beach, Gainesville, along interstate highways and state roads. It offered him mobility and anonymity. He offered beer, marijuana, a lift to the girls, sex for money if he picked up a prostitute. He also liked to kill women, hitchhikers, those with broken down vehicles, prostitutes, any random female he saw walking. He referred to the women as, quote-unquote, young ladies. He tried to find at-risk women and those who may not be immediately missed. All the victims needed transportation. None of his victims were sexually assaulted, to our knowledge, by Stano. All were female. Most were white. Most had shoulder-length hair. All were essentially strangers. Quote, he would trigger the argument because he had to kill. When he was drinking and insulted, he would see red, using what he had handy as a murder weapon, his hands, a knife, a can opener, a gun. In a rage, his reaction was overkill. Overkill is any additional wounds past what is necessary to kill a victim. He didn't rape them. He didn't rob them of their jewelry. Stano transported his victim, killed them, and after relieving his tension, he dumped them and posed them many times. After the murder, he would always take the victim's purse or identification to throw the items along with their shoes out of his souped-up car. He was a neat freak who would ritualistically clean his vehicles, himself, and then the horrible cycle would start again. While Gerald Eugene Stano's conviction rate was not as high as, say, John Wayne Gacy, his confessed death tally was double. Stano may also have killed women and girls in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The state of Florida, as they began to arrest and convict Stano, was not going to allow this multiple serial murderer to travel to the other states, to go to the sites, to try to prove that he had killed these women in other states. They allowed him to look at maps, but this series is going to focus on his Florida crime spree. So let's get into it. 7 years of killing in Florida. On March 21st, 1973, 2 women were found dead in the woods in North Gainesville. Their bodies were found on March 21st, and the victims were in their late teens. The bodies had no identification, and they were both fully clothed. Neither appeared to be sexually assaulted. The bodies were found 50 feet away from an abandoned church and an abandoned lumber yard. It appeared that both had been killed at the scene. To try to pin down the location, the victims were found in a vacant lot outside of the city on State Road 24, on or around. They were stabbed to death with multiple knife wounds, and they were found by a city road crew around Northeast 10th Avenue and 18th Street in a very wooded area. Most of the areas that were the dumping grounds for Gerald Eugene Stano were extremely rural, wooded, places that weren't probably known by someone who wasn't a local of those areas at the time. Even though he used rural, wooded areas, he would take no care to the bodies. He would not bury them. He would leave them to be found or exposed to the elements. And these victims were found a mere 10 yards away from each other. On March 24th, 1973, 2 days later, the slain Gainesville girls, their names were released, and they were identified as Ann Eugenia Arsenault, otherwise known as Annie Oakley, who was 17 years old, and Janine Marie Ligatino, who was 19 years old. A detective had taken the pictures of the girls to show the local students to try to assess if these girls went to high school and if they could be located that way. But the street people, or what would be known as flower children, remember we're back in 1973, they were the ones that helped to identify the 2 girls. And they then found out that Ann Arsenault was from Silver Springs, Maryland, and she had graduated from high school 1 year early, so she was smart. She traveled to Florida from Silver Springs, Maryland, and first to the Florida Keys for a few weeks, and then on to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And then she headed back to Florida with some new friends instead of returning to Maryland. She had met Janine Ligatino, Jean Marie, and they met in Gainesville. Both the girls were very similar in appearance. They were slender with delicate features, and they sold flowers on the street for spending money, and then they panhandled when necessary. Both women were short. They were tan with long brown hair and eyes, and both had boyfriends, and they were just simply hitchhiking on a rainy night along East University Avenue into town for beer and cigarettes, when a Duster, that's a car, this 1970s car, came along. They accepted a ride. One would assume they were not prostitutes and unlikely to want sex with a Stano, as they were both in relationships, very young girls, and they had been seen hitchhiking at about 1 a.m. on March 21st by Police Lieutenant Mike Allison. He also turns out to be, in retrospect, a 24-year veteran of the Gainesville Police Department before he went on to become, I believe, the chief in another place. So, Arsenault, the body was stabbed 5 times. Ligatino was stabbed 13 times. So, again, classic overkill. Where was Stano during this time, you may ask? Well, in March of 1973, the time of the murders, Stano's had drove from Pennsylvania to Florida to visit his brother's fiancée, who lived down here, and Gerald Eugene Stano was at this time in 1973 about 21 or 22 years of age. So he was slightly older than his victims. Sometimes when you're looking back at a case, you have to look at the age of the perpetrator of the suspect or the killer in relation to his victims. And in this case, he was about 4 or 5 years of age in difference from, say, Ann, slightly older than his victims. On November 1982, a grand jury indicted Stano for these murders, the murders of Ann Eugenia Stano and Janine Marie Ligatino. And I have a question. Do you think that these were his first murders? That Stano would kill 2 girls at the same time for his first human kill? Personally, I don't think so. At one point, I have to add, if there's ever been other confessions, a mental patient in another state allegedly admitted to killing Ann, didn't make any mention of Janine, and they were both together, killed together, and found at the scene together. But this mental patient was completely discredited. He wasn't even in the state. Many times you hear of false confessions. You'll hear of that in this case, so I thought I would mention it. On November 4th, 1982, an Alachua County grand jury indicted Stano for the 2 local murders of Ann Stano and Jean Marie Ligatino. 9 years after these murders had been committed in 1973, so 1982, at this point in the story, Stano was suspected of killing 40 women by this time. He admitted to murders in Florida, in New Jersey, and in Pennsylvania. I'm not going to get into the alleged murders in New Jersey or Pennsylvania in this story, because later then he admitted that he didn't kill anyone in New Jersey. Of course, he would have a reason for saying that, but let's get into his confession for Ann Eugenia Stano and Jean Marie Ligatino. When Stano finally did confess to killing the hitchhikers, he said that one was wearing gypsy-like clothing and the other was wearing boots. See, Stano killed so many people. He wasn't always really great with the dates, but he was really good with remembering the incidences where he picked them up, what their clothing looked like, and some random details, and then where he dumped them. He said that they were sharing a Crown Royal Cola, that Janine watched Ann die and fought to save her own life, hence the 13 stab wounds. He put the bodies in the woods near a church, and sure enough, the description matched the bodies, the clothing that had not been released to the public. The Crown Royal Cola had not been released to the public at that time. And I do believe he led the investigators right to where he had dumped the bodies. Okay? Needle in a haystack. In a 1973 letter to the Gainesville Sun, Ann's mother was quoted about her daughter, quote, "She was love, sunshine, joy, and cheer to all of us who met her. Her family weeps for the loss of her warmth and good cheer, from which we drew strength." I like to end with a statement or a comment from each person's family. I think it's more important to understand the effect this has on not only the victims, give them a face and a life, but also the families of the victims who are also victims. So let's move on to the next murder of Barbara Ann Bauer. Regarding Daytona Beach, where Stano then moved near, he started using this as a hunting ground for predators, and the detective Paul Crow that became involved with this case said about Daytona Beach at that time, and maybe even still today, it's a place where there are a lot of young kids, young girls, and it's an easy stomping grounds for people like that. I would agree. On September 6, 1973, Barbara Ann Bauer, age 17, of New Smyrna Beach, was shopping in Daytona. She was a high school student from New Smyrna Beach High, an honor society member, a beta club member, a pep club member. And she was just shopping in Daytona. The honor student went running an errand at 3:30 in the afternoon to pick up some fabric for her cheerleader uniform or flag team uniform in the J.M. Field Shopping Center, which I believe is now called the Holly Hill Shopping Center off Nova Road and Mason Avenue. She purchased the material at the shop, and the shopkeeper remembered seeing her. Barbara Ann Bauer didn't make it home back for dinner at 5:30, which she had said she'd be back at 5:30 for dinner. Allegedly, she was stranded due to her car breaking down due to a dead battery. She was reported missing on the very same day. According to the family, police allegedly thought Barbara was a runaway, but Bauer's parents kept telling them, no, she's not a runaway. They were critical of the police for not immediately searching for their daughter. Of course, we know in retrospect that Barbara Bauer was likely killed shortly after her disappearance, and while an immediate investigation may not have stopped her death, it may have caught Stano and stopped a string of future killings of young women. By September 9th of 1973, the sheriffs were on the hunt for Barbara Ann Bauer's car. On the 30th of September 1973, it was located in Valdosta, Georgia, and the car was then hauled to the Valdosta police station because once they ran the tag, they saw that it was missing persons and the car was reported. So witnesses were then queried in that area of Valdosta, and on October 3rd of 1973, the witnesses described the Bauer car that Barbara, or actually her brother, it was her brother's car. The blue vehicle had been seen, and two witnesses in Valdosta, Georgia, saw a middle-aged man getting out of Barbara's 1973 powder blue Duster. And there were no signs of violence in the car. It looked like it had been wiped down for prints. So this powder blue Plymouth Duster that had allegedly had, a stalled battery at the J.M. Field Shopping Center was then located in Valdosta, Georgia at an Azalea City motel located at I-75 and US 84. It was left in the parking lot with the keys inside and a quarter tank of gas. And, people reported seeing a man aged 40, 6 feet tall, average height and weight. And it was also noted once the vehicle was taken to the police station that 850 miles were put on the speedometer of the powder blue Plymouth Duster. And, it was her brother's car. It was the car. The nameplate Burt, B-U-R-T, was on the front plate of the car, which I believe I have a picture that I can put up of a typical Plymouth Duster from the 70s. So, because sometimes you need to get a visual image of what in the world that looked like. And also note that the powder blue Plymouth Duster was her twin brother, her fraternal twin brother Bert's car. And she is not the only twin in this case, strangely enough. So, on April 10th, 1974, the police find a girl's body in the woods in Bradford County. The body was later identified as the missing girl, Barbara Ann Bauer, and the remains were skeletal. See, Florida's subtropical climate, it's real destructive to dead bodies. An account of who found the body was that, and I've seen two accounts, but I think this is the accurate one, that the body was found by a farmer who was looking for his guinea hens. She was literally 100 miles from her home, and the body had been beaten and choked. She had received several blows to the head. She was wearing the Ohio State t-shirt that she had on when she left. If you think if Daytona to Valdosta is 100 miles, and if they, according to the confession I'm going to tell you, if they drove an hour and a half to Valdosta, or if they went an hour and a half driving around trying to recharge her battery, not returning the car to Daytona. If you were to figure that out, it's not going to equate to 150 miles. So it's apparent that someone drove that car for quite a while before dumping it in Valdosta, Georgia. So let me get into the confession. Allegedly, when Stano gets around to confessing, he said he helped her with her car. He drove her up to Bradford County. The body was found west of I-95, east of State Road 17 in a heavily wooded area. At one point in Stano's years of confessions, he allegedly said he had an accomplice for this one named Edmund Hoehn, Hoehn. Also, he calls him Sammy Henderson. I don't know if it's one and the same or if he was simply just trying to invent a person. Sammy. Edmund was a real person. Stano said that he noticed a young lady that was standing there with the hood of her car open, and she was wearing cut-off shorts or cut-off jeans and wearing an Ohio State shirt with the number 21. And he jump-started her stalled car with Sammy's car. Now, keep in mind, he's going to change this confession to edit out ye old Sammy or Edmund. So you can just imagine it was him alone more than likely. So he told Barbara that they needed to drive the car to recharge the battery. And he noticed red fabric in the back seat of her car and a Hancock fabric shop bag. Again, this is something that was not released to the public that he was able to tie down. Sammy allegedly followed Stano, with Stano driving Barbara's car to recharge the battery. And that Sammy was allegedly following because Stano assumed that Sammy would have sex with Barbara, this elusive alleged Sammy, and that they drove 30 minutes and stopped for gas and paid in cash, and that Barbara, of course, got anxious and made a move to drive her own car because surely the battery had been charged up by now, and she didn't see the reason of driving around town, and Stano hit her and told her to get into the passenger seat. And he backhanded her as they pulled out of the service station. And they drove for 1.5 hours, according to his testimony, that Barbara was shaking and crying and, shaking like a leaf, begging to be let out. And he knocked her out at the dump site. He said that when they arrived at the dump site, that Sammy was busy rolling up the windows of his car. He had a convertible, and pulling up the top of the convertible, and that Barbara was placed in that car, and Stano killed her and laid her body on the side with her head facing north. Turns out when he does end up confessing again, it's the same story, just minus the Edmund and the Sammy, that, simply he did it by himself. So, what happened to this alleged accomplice? Well, Stano and Edmund Hoehn, they were arraigned for her murders on October 11th, 1982. And by October 14th, 1982, Hoehn was held at the Bradford County Jail without bond and indicted by a grand jury. By November 10th, so less than a month from the first confession, Stano said that he lied in implicating Hoehn simply because he hated Hoehn. So later on, when Stano did confess, he pretty much told the exact same story, leaving out a second partner. He went on to add that, after he had hit her and she started to scream, he was reaching down to pick her up. She started to scream, and he didn't want anything to be heard, so he hit her. And as we know, her body was actually found beaten and choked. So, strangely enough, the Bauer's home on Flagler Avenue, because everybody in the Flagler area knew about this missing girl, and then, the missing car, and then the car being found in Valdosta, and then once her body was discovered in Bradford, the Flagler Avenue house became sort of some odd, macabre attraction, and because it stood abandoned for 25 years. Now, I think it wasn't a scene of a crime, but strangely enough, it was filled with all the abandoned furniture and clothing, and people act as if that the Bauers just up and left that house, and people began to assume that it was haunted, and that it was even featured on the 90-minute ghost tours of the area. People can be very odd. There was nothing in association with this house, but for whatever reason, Yeah, they had ghost tours. So in June of 2007, the Bauer family opted to have the house torn down. You know, they said it wasn't haunted. It simply needed too many repairs. And they wanted to live elsewhere, and they had money to get another house, and they just let that one sit there with what they didn't need in it. So, but ironically enough, around January 21st of 1974, there was more than one serial killer that was dumping in that location, but you have to remember it was also a landfill area, because there was yet a fifth decomposed female body that was found in this area, which is the north area of Kennedy Space Center. It's known as the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. So we'll be getting into more of these victims that were found in close proximity. So to get back to Barbara Ann Bauer, on August 23rd, 1982, Don Denton from the Bradford County Sheriff's Office had interviewed Stano. And as a result of this, in 1983, Stano ends up pleading guilty to the deaths of 3 women. Now, see, I'm going to tell you these murders in order, in chronological order. The way they were discovered and the way he confessed was almost backwards. All right? So it's very confusing. I'm just going to go ahead, tell you the murders in the chronological order, his confessions to those murders, and also the adjudication of those murders. So he pled guilty to the deaths of 3 women in 83. He was in the Florida State Prison in Stark, serving life sentences. And what his goal was to avoid the death penalty. So he did confess to this murder. And I'm going to give the last word to the family. Her father said, quote, "It boils down to one thing. My baby was murdered." In November of 1973, Stano moved to Daytona Beach, and he would also cruise the Dale Mabry Boulevard in Tampa. It needs to be made clear that he would use the interstate highways. He would cruise from one end of the coast to the other, which isn't a long distance, and he would enjoy all kinds of shenanigans on his outings. On December 14th, 1973, high school student Kathy Lee Scharf, age 17, disappeared. She was reported missing from Volusia County. On December 14th, Kathy left home with 2 girlfriends and went to the Wreck Bar, that's W-R-E-K bar, then went to a man's house, and then she left. She was last seen walking on Ridgewood Avenue. You'll also see that Ridgewood Avenue features in so many of these cases. On January 19th, 1974, at 10 a.m., Dennis Farrell, while hunting with a partner, discovered her body in the Merritt Island Cape Refuge off a dirt road, which I believe is known as Haulover Canal. The original narrow canal was shallow, and big boats had to be hauled over, and that's how it got its name, the Haulover Canal. James A. McDonald Jr. from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office was called to the scene. It's around A1A North Merritt Island, mile marker 72, if you had to try to pin down the location in these extremely rural areas. The victims partially decomposed about 4 to 8 weeks. They're estimating she'd been out there. The remains were discovered. She was stabbed to death. The body was partially submerged in 4 to 6 inches of water and posed in an unusual position. I'm going to try to describe this, short of putting up the photos. Her legs were spread underneath her thighs. Her calves were underneath the thighs towards the sides. The victim was wearing a tank top, shirt, blue, yellow, and red stripes, blue jeans rolled up mid-calf, no shoes. The white female was approximately 20 years old, 5 foot 2 inches, 110 pounds. It also appeared that the victim was killed at the scene. It looked like that she had perhaps bled out at the scene. Palmetto leaves, 8 to 10, were placed on top of the body. This is another Stano M.O. Steve Kendrick of Brevard County Sheriff's Office responded to the crime scene of heavily dense vegetation, trees, brush, undergrowth, near an orange grove. The victim had an Indian ring on her left hand, and another ring was found underneath her body. The palm fronds appeared to have been deliberately placed there due to the pattern and the palm trees not being in the near proximity. In other words, not close enough to naturally fall upon the body. Someone probably had to go and pick them, or pick them from wherever they fell on the ground and then come over and move them to where she was located and then arrange them on her body. A Jane Doe intelligence bulletin was created by the Brevard County Sheriff's Office. And on August 6, 1974, Kathy Lee Scharf was identified. She had been working at a restaurant as a busgirl. And again, her body had been found in an advanced state of decomposition. The pathologist was unable to determine the cause of death initially. The parents identified her by her clothing and by her jewelry. And she disappeared from Port Orange on December 14th, 1973. She was stabbed. Now, when someone says initially they can't determine the cause of death, it's usually because of the decomposition. But once they get to looking at the bones, they can see that there's knife marks on the bones and things like that, and they can determine that the victim had been stabbed. So Kathy Scharf was identified by her dental records. Dr. Stanton Bass had been her dentist, and he testified to her identity. On March 1981, so think a good 8 years later, Stano was advised of his rights, and he waived those rights in written form and in oral form, and the interview was taped and not edited. So Stano confessed for the first time in this murder in March of 1981. Now, this is the problem in telling this story in chronological order, but I'm going to do it anyway. So if you get to find out stuff more than once, or stuff seems a little confusing, that's because these victims were not found in order, and he did not confess to them in order. But regardless, at this point in the narrative, there was a problem for Stano because he had already committed all these murders. It's 1981. He's confessing to these murders out of order, and he ends up confessing to essentially 6 murders, and he's told through his plea bargaining that if anything's out of the Seventh Circuit, don't mention it. This is what he's legally advised to do. And he was serving life sentences in a bargain that he wouldn't get the death penalty. So by the time he's admitting to Scharf, he's causing himself a bit of a problem because she is out of the Seventh Circuit. This case has a lot of information to it because this one went through appeals, and on August 11th of 1982, Johnny L. Manis of the Daytona Police Department advised Stano of his rights, which he waived, and Stano confessed to Johnny Manis. He says he picked up the victim, which was Kathy Lee Scharf, on Route 1. She was hitchhiking. He then went towards A1A. He turned left onto an orange grove where he stabbed her and then placed her on the canal bank. He mentioned that the victim was wearing some Indian jewelry. The next day, on August 12, 1982, the interview was taped. It hadn't been taped the day before due to the fact that I believe one of the police department folks that went up to interview him was late, and they just jumped right into it. So on the second day, they started over and they taped the interview. Stano said he was driving his green Plymouth Satellite. He said that the victim had been wearing a tie-dye color blouse and had Indian-type jewelry, that he knifed the victim. He carried her from his car. He laid her in a stagnant pond. He had to walk through the, quote, mucky water. He almost ruined his shoes. Then he placed branches over her. In a taped confession, John Manis asked him, quote, was she wanting out of the car? Or just didn't like the way you were driving, or what? To which Stano replied, quote, "It was a combination of both. She wanted out, and I said, 'No, you're not going to get out.' And she said, 'I'm going to get out anyway.' And I said, 'Try if you want.' But she couldn't do it because I have the kind of door locks that once your hands get slippery or wet." And that was trailed off the end of that quote. What happened was that he had these door locks that made it near to impossible for the passenger to try to get out of the car. Very Ted Bundy-like. So Stano struck her, which quieted her for a while, and then Stano choked the victim multiple times. He said, quote, "This is the end of the line. She started to shake, and I put a cease to it." Stano's statement regarding the Scharf's clothing, regarding her age, her general description, matched that of the victim. Additionally, Stano used the names of the roads as they were known the year of the murder. That would be 1974, versus the names of the roads as they had been named in 1982. For example, A1A was redesignated State Road 3 about at the area of the Kennedy Space Center. Dean Moxley of Brevard County, he was the one that prosecuted this case, and Lieutenant Paul Crow from the Daytona Beach Police Department did not participate in the development of this case for trial. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of hay will be made on appeal about Crow's alleged coercion and Stano's confessions. But this case for Kathy Lee Scharf was always a Brevard County Sheriff's case and never a joint investigation with any other agency. And if you think that they're going to allow some Crow from Daytona Beach to come in and run a Brevard County case, you have another think coming. But let's get into it. On July of 1983, okay? Clarence Zack, who was a jailhouse snitch, was allegedly placed in the same jail as Stano, according to Stano's appeals years later. So this is what's being said years later. And that Zack was being held in the quote-unquote shower cell. And that Zack, of course, was a convicted felon who'd recently traded his testimony for favorable treatment of 60 years in prison to avoid the death penalty. This fellow, Zack, had been convicted in a 1981 plotting the assassination of the Brevard chief prosecutor, I do believe. Also regarding Zack, ironically, his co-defendants, Zack's co-defendants in Zack's own cases, pled guilty. So it seems in retrospect that Zack's plea deal wasn't even as necessary, but regardless, Zack had his own time, he had his own charges to mitigate. So when Stano went to contest his appeal for this case, all right, he was charged for this case, and he had a first trial, and everybody thought it was a slam dunk for the Scharf case. And it turns out that there was a mistrial, or a hung jury, should I say.